Hey guys, this is Nick here from T3 Training. I just want to record a short video today about V02 Max and lactate threshold and the implications this has for your training and what you should be focusing on with your training. So when we talk about the V02 Max, the V02 Max is the maximum amount of oxygen the body can use during exercise. So this is really referring to the peak intensity, often referred to as aerobic power. And this is expressed in milliliters per kilogram per minute. The lactate threshold, however, is the highest exercise intensity in which the production of lactate and its clearance is balanced. So this is more about sustainability. It's more about what is the intensity that you can sustain for a duration of time around 20 to 60 minutes. In contrast to the V02 Max, which is what is the peak intensity compared to lactate threshold, what is the maximum sustainable intensity. So lactate threshold often, and it's essentially the same as the onset of blood lactate accumulation, the muscle lactate steady state concentration, also the anaerobic threshold. Lactate threshold is really aerobic capacity and it's expressed as millimoles per liter. I want to just describe this graph to you because I think it describes and demonstrates well what these things are. So on the bottom here, we're looking at exercise intensity, and here we're looking at blood lactate concentration. So at rest, there is a small amount of lactate in the blood, around 0.5 to 1 millimoles per liter. And so what happens is as we begin to exercise at a low level, the blood lactate concentration will stay the same. At the exercise intensity, where the blood lactate starts to increase above normal baseline level, that is called the aerobic threshold, or LT1. Okay, so that is one point on the graph that's important, where the blood lactate rises above resting levels. And in this aerobic zone, it will start to increase as the exercise intensity increases. It will increase to a point where we reach the anaerobic threshold, or the lactate threshold, where the amount of lactate will accumulate and there'll be an inflection point on the graph. And this point here is referred to as the anaerobic threshold, OBLA, MLSS, or lactate threshold. As we continue to exercise with increasing intensity, the blood lactate will increase to a point where you can't exercise at a higher intensity, and that the peak here is called the V02 Max. If we look at this on a blood lactate curve, so when you're doing a blood lactate test, the test is where you exercise with increasing intensity and you take a blood lactate sample essentially every 3 minutes. And as the exercise intensity goes up, every step, every 3 minutes, the blood lactate will increase. So here we can see at low levels at resting, it's fairly stable. At the aerobic threshold, it starts to increase. It increases. And then here is the anaerobic threshold, or the lactate threshold, where there's the inflection point where it starts to accumulate. Now, there are numerous ways that will determine where the inflection point is on the graph. The easiest one is where there's been an increase of 1 millimole or greater on 2 consecutive points on the graph. So here you can see 2.3 to 3.5 is over 1, and 3.5 to 5 is again greater than 1. So here is the lactate threshold. Here they're looking at watts, so this is a bike threshold test. So this here is the functional threshold, or the FTP, and they're saying here's 255 watts. What I want to talk about is in relation to your training to try and determine the V02, the lactate threshold, how these interact, and then how that implies to your training. So there are 4 markers here on the graph that you want to establish. And when we talk about VO2, VO2 is not as trainable as the lactate threshold. It's harder to change. And there is a genetic ceiling to the VO2. So at a point, if you keep just doing VO2 training, you'll hit a ceiling and you can't go through it. You're not going to improve it anymore. However, a lot of athletes will not be operating. Their VO2 will not be at their genetic ceiling, so they still have room for improvement. So we want to determine where the genetic ceiling is, where the current VO2 is, where the lactate threshold is, and then what is the goal race pace. So we want to, as a percentage, determine where is the lactate threshold in comparison to the VO2. So if we take VO2 as 100%, where is the lactate threshold in relation to that? And then we also want to look at the goal race pace. Where is that in relation to the lactate threshold, where the lactate threshold is referenced as 100%. So for example, in triathlon, if we look at an Olympic distance or a sprint distance, you're going to be racing very close to your lactate threshold. So say, for example, your lactate threshold, when we think about FTP, for example, is 250. You might be able to race at around the lactate threshold 250 for these sprint and Olympic distance races. As the duration gets longer, obviously you're not going to be able to race at that threshold for the longer duration events. So that's where we need to look at what percentage of lactate threshold are you racing at, or is your goal. So in well-trained, elite athletes, for the 70.3, they might be able to hold and race at 90% of their lactate threshold. For an Ironman, perhaps 80% of the lactate threshold could be their goal race pace in well-trained athletes. When we look at where is the lactate threshold in compared to VO2, in highly trained athletes, the lactate threshold can be as close as 90% to the VO2. And this is an important one to consider. So I put together an example here for this athlete. So say we have determined through the testing that their current VO2 is 250 watts. This is a cycling example. So 250 watts is the current VO2, and that's 100%. The lactate threshold is 200 watts, which is 80% of 250. So what we're seeing here is that the threshold is 80% of the VO2. So if we know 90% is kind of like the maximum you can get to, there is room here to improve the lactate threshold. With threshold training, we could bump up the threshold closer to the current VO2. When we look at this person's goal race pace, say their goal race pace is 190 watts. 190 watts is 95% of 200. So they're going to try and race at 95% of their lactate threshold. As we talked about before, this might be okay for a sprint distance or an Olympic distance. This is going to be very difficult for a 70.3 and unachievable for an Ironman. So this person is going to an Ironman right now. There's no way they're going to be able to hold 190 watts. They're going to be, this number needs to be more around probably 70 to 80, depending on their level and how trained they are. So the room for improvement here is in the threshold. We can improve this person's threshold, push it up closer to the VO2. But then we also need to be realistic about what pace they're going to be able to race at, depending on what event they're training for. Okay, in this example, let's assume this person is not well trained. They haven't done a lot of training, so we can kind of assume that their VO2 is not close to their VO2 genetic ceiling. So we determine their VO2 is 250. Their current lactate threshold is 235. Now 235 is 94% of 100. Sorry, it's 94% of 250. So we may think, oh, this person is holding a high percentage of their lactate threshold compared to VO2. They must be well trained. But in essence, what's happened here is that their VO2 is underdeveloped. They're not very developed in the anaerobic system, and their VO2 is nowhere near their genetic ceiling. So this is actually an untrained athlete who has a poor anaerobic system. So there's no room here to improve the threshold. The threshold is at 94% of VO2. So we're not gonna, if we do threshold training all day, it's not gonna be able to, it's not gonna improve because we can't have the lactate threshold higher than the current VO2. There's no room here to improve the threshold. If we look here, for example, if they are training for an Ironman and their goal race wattage is 210, 210 is 89% of the threshold 235. So that's not going to work for an Ironman. They're not going to be able to hold 89% of their threshold for an Ironman, especially when they're untrained. But the question is, what do we do here? If this person was going to go into a race tomorrow, you would tell them you have to race at a wattage that's around 70% of your lactate threshold. But if we have a lot of time to improve, what are we going to decide to improve first? If we try and improve the threshold, there's no room for improvement there. So we're not going to get anywhere. So we have to first push the VO2 up to create some room to improve the lactate threshold. So the first block, maybe some VO2 training, push the VO2 up, and then work more on the aerobic system to improve the threshold. That's it. If you're interested in this sort of training, looking at your VO2 and your lactate threshold, feel free to contact me. Thank you.